No camera today, friends. This is not the normal kind of episode. Indeed, I'm going to call this a burst. It's a burst of passion. It's a burst of horror. It's a burst of weeping. And hopefully, it will have a burst of prayer and prayerfulness in it as well. Because if it doesn't have prayer and prayerfulness, it will simply be ranting. And I don't want to rant. I've been through something in the last few days, something that disturbed me greatly. I almost want to say it shocked me, but that wouldn't be right. How can you be shocked by the air that you breathe? I'll be explaining that in a moment. Essentially, I've had an unaccustomed, in-depth immersion in materialism. And before I tell you about this immersion in materialism, I think we just need to really clearly define what we mean by materialism on this channel. Because many people just think about materialism as something commercial. You know, materialism is the more and more money-obsessed nature of our society, or obsession with the latest fashions, the latest computers, the latest smartphones, the latest gadgets, or for all I know, in some cases, kinky sex toys. Certainly, I mean that by materialism. But I mean something deeper that underlies all of that. And as I see it, without which our materialistic, capitalistic society could never have been born. So very briefly, I mean philosophical materialism. I mean the way philosophers and key cultural figures of the last centuries have created an ever more materialistic worldview and ideology. So, whether it's someone like, Karl Marx, who concerns himself entirely with the means of production and who controls the means of production and denies the transcendent, religion is the opium of the people, the sigh of the oppressed, or whether it's Freud, who locates, it would seem at times, nearly all of our actions and behaviors in sex, in libido, and then tries to free us from this by speaking about any guilt that we have about sex as being unhealthy. A biological drive, that is materialism, where there is no hint of the transcendent, or as I've been speaking about in recent episodes about Valentin Tomberg, there's a whole thread of mainly Anglo-Saxon empiricist and rationalist philosophy going on since around the time of the Enlightenment, whether we're speaking of people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, David Hume, or the utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill. Throughout English society, English Protestant society, there has arisen currents of materialism negating the transcendent. I don't want to say that the Enlightenment, of course, is purely English. There are figures, obviously there like Descartes or Voltaire in France, who although Voltaire was really importing, a lot of, John Locke into France. But yes, there's a distinct current of Anglo-Saxon empiricist philosophy that has also created this culture of materialistic philosophy that we've been addressing a little bit in the episodes about Tomberg, because Tomberg was very gravely concerned with these kinds of currents. But I want to dive in to what happened to me. I've got a true story to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, but I've got to say it's true in essence, because I feel like I need to change the details, the particulars, a very great deal. So not only are the names changed to protect the innocent, and I do mean to use the word innocent. The protagonists in this story, in so many ways, are innocent. Innocent of the materialism that has been foisted on them. All right? But not only am I going to change the names to protect the innocent, I might well change the genders, I might well exaggerate or minimize certain details about the number of protagonists. I need to sort of shroud the particulars here in a level of anonymity. But even though the particulars are distorted, the essence of what I want to communicate today is true. So I'm going to be telling you a tale of a rather disconcerting encounter that I recently had with, let's say, a milieu of materialism, a milieu of cultural Marxism, cultural, Freudianism. I want to say cultural not humanism, but the philosophy that goes back to, the Scottish empiricist philosopher David Hume. So many traditionalists are aware that modern society is the product of people like Freud and Marx, and yet they're hardly aware at all of the enormous impact on our culture of, say, David Hume, who, briefly put, you could say, served to introduce into the West a radical skepticism, simply emphasizing empirical experience, denying the transcendent, and reducing ethics and morality to mere human sentiment. So I've basically been participating in a very small gathering where the dominant narrative was materialism, although few seemed conscious of that. But for me, it was like a jolting experience of being like a fish out of water. And to really make clear how foreign this is to me, I want to just tell you, ladies and gentlemen, a little bit about the life that is ordinary for me. So, as some of you know, I live in a tiny little village, really a hamlet in the northwest of Ireland, where the culture is entirely Catholic in this little hamlet, and the Catholic Church still matters here. People go to Mass here every Sunday. I can see the chapel from my window. I'm very much participating now in this Novus Ordo liturgy, not through choice, I have to say. I want to be in a situation where I can participate in the Latin Mass. But the Latin Mass is a long way away from us, and certain personal difficulties have stopped us going there. Fortunately, in our parish, there is a thread of tradition. There's a priest who gives communion on the tongue, but it's very much the Novus Ordo. And that's the world that I'm in, and this is the world that I've been living in for years now. And in some ways, going off on a tangent here, I do find the new Mass very difficult. But on the other hand, I feel Providence is here because living in this Irish Catholic hamlet gives me a very profound sense of what Catholic Ireland was. Even here in 2022, I'm surrounded by Catholics who believe in God, Catholics who are praying at their ancestors' graves. I'm being blessed to go to Irish wakes and Irish funerals, to go to Mass with these people day in, day out over years. People who actually touch me, touch my heart, touch me to the core of my being. At some point, I want to do a video where I really pay tribute to this Irish Catholic world that Providence allows me to participate in. So, yeah, this is my world. And obviously, no, maybe not obviously, but people who know my videos will know that I try to abstain a great deal from social media. I don't have any kind of mobile phone. In fact, the hamlet I am in is so remote that you can't get a mobile phone signal here. Now, even if we could get a mobile signal, you wouldn't catch me dead with a mobile phone. Because it seems to me that smartphones and the kind of culture they generate, they come at an enormous cost, an enormous price. With the whole set of expectations that I see being created these days, that, people will be instantly available to people, in theory anywhere across the planet. This has never existed in human history before. But I'm seeing more and more evidence of incredibly speeded up pace of life with smartphones, with social media, with messaging, such that people, feel guilty. It seems if they don't get back to people, almost instantly or in the next day or two. This kind of pace of life carries an enormous cost. It robs us of our capacity to be prayerful and to be still. Obviously, there are great benefits and great advantages as well, but I am, ladies and gentlemen, very scared of a sort of smartphone and mobile phone, social media culture that means that more and more and more we're being pushed into this back forth, the zing, 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 back and forth kind of messaging, when really, facing the crises that we do on the planet today, we need stillness, reflection, prayer. I know that my life would incredibly suffer if I were part of this culture. And I don't just mean my stillness, my prayer, or my reflection. I mean my research, I mean my writing, I mean my speaking. My capacity, whatever capacity I have to think in a creative and original way, at least for me, I'm convinced it would really suffer if I were that plugged into this culture. Anyway, I am digressing, but it's a digression with a purpose. I suppose I'm telling you about living what will strike many of you as a very sheltered, isolated existence. An existence where I can peer into what Catholic Ireland was, before the invasion of modern culture. So yes, I don't have a television. I don't participate that much in the milieu of modern materialism. I am sheltered from it. So it becomes all the more shocking to me when I encounter it full on. And that is what's happened. But shocking's not the word I want. Because obviously I know this exists. I used to be, if you like, a cultural Marxist or a cultural Freudian myself. I used to be, at least, that's maybe putting it too strongly, but all those things thoroughly soak me. As, a British person who comes out of British society, it's just the air that we breathe. Does a fish in the ocean know that it's wet? No. The fish has to jump out of the ocean, so to speak. So this is part of the story here as well, that the protagonists in my story have no idea that they are the children of Marx, the children of Freud, the children of David Hume, because I've somehow, by the grace of God, been able to jump from this ocean of materialism. I can see the ocean. I dare to say that I can see the ocean of materialism in a way that not everyone can. So in that sense, none of this shocks me. But maybe, in another sense, it does shock me. Because, I've said this before, you can know that there is a world out there where children are dying from malnutrition and starving. It's one thing to know that world exists. But if you really experience a world where you're holding a dying child in your arms, it's something completely different. Or, we know that Russians and Ukrainians are doing terrible things to each other right now. But, if I were to go, into the battlefields and the cities that have been assaulted by the Russians, or if I were to go into this whole kind of terrible world, I would know it in a way that I do not know it now. And because I've been so long outside of this milieu of materialism, it does not exactly shock me, but nonetheless, I suppose the horror of it, the horror of what it really means, hits me in a way that it doesn't when I'm just sort of in my sheltered little Irish Catholic environment. So I was suddenly thrust into a round-the-clock, morning, afternoon, evening world of materialism. I want to say that the people that I was engaged with struck me as kind, decent, cultured people, and yet people who had so succumbed to the narrative of the liberal materialistic mainstream that obviously from my point of view they were missing so much. I'll give you a little story, slightly distort the details, but essence true. A guy called Jack, say. Jack is British, and here as I'm recording this, we've recently had in the British Isles here and, in Britain, the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. May she rest in peace, and may God grant her all the rewards she deserves for her maintaining a witness to Christianity and Christian culture over so long. But anyway, Jack felt up to his neck in the sort of media presentation of the royal funeral. Jack is very much a Republican, and Jack said something very interesting, that he'd absorbed. He had been watching it all. He had been watching the funeral, and he'd seen a lot of Christianity. And it had produced a realization in Jack. Jack said, I never realized that, British society, this is in essence what he said, was so imbued with Christianity. And I actually realize that I've had this all around me all my life. I went to a Church of England school, and there were all these things. And the word that Jack actually used was indoctrinated. I haven't realized how much I've been indoctrinated by Christianity all these years. It's new to Jack. Okay? So this time of royal funeral, mourning for the Queen in England, has actually brought to the surface of consciousness the Christian heritage of Britain. But the way Jack, the Republican, is interpreting it is that this is all indoctrination. He has been indoctrinated his entire life by Christianity, and he's sort of realizing that it's kind of seeped into his cells without him even realizing it. Now, I didn't feel it was apropos to start arguing with Jack. I dropped a couple of things. But, what was clear to me was that Jack has been indoctrinated by the Enlightenment. He's been indoctrinated by the materialistic thinking of British thinkers, like Locke or Hume. Locke might not be technically a materialist, but there's a very strong materialistic tendency there. Jack has been indoctrinated, from my point of view, with the British empiricist philosophy all his life that has now yielded British materialism. During our time together, Jack made many comments that were redolent of Freud, but I don't think it's ever occurred to Jack that maybe he's been indoctrinated by Freud, or at least the children of Freud. This is hard, friends. I want to stress again, Jack, these people that I met, they struck me as good people. There was something very lovely about Jack. A genuine idealism, care about the world. Really, it's not so much Jack that I'm speaking about, and indeed, Jack might be, more than one person. I'm distorting details here, conflating things. But I'm really speaking about the idea of indoctrination that was actually raised during this weekend. The idea that Jack said all his life, growing up in these, schools and so on and so forth, where Christianity was invoked, at least in a nominal way, he realized, so he said, that he'd been indoctrinated by Christianity, without sort of realizing that maybe he was being indoctrinated by other things. That's what I want to emphasize here, not personalities. Because another thing that was very clear for me at this gathering was, the ideas of the children of Marx, so to speak. Indoctrination around how everything is just economic. And I'll give you an example here. The whole idea of the 1916 Easter Rising Irish Revolution came up that sort of astonishingly led to Irish independence 6 years later in 1922. That whole issue came up, and it really seemed to me that it was all being interpreted in economic terms. Jack, or these people, were not thinking in terms of people 100 years ago who cared about the Catholic faith, or cared about the Irish language, or cared about Irish culture as something separate and distinct from British culture. I'm sure, and I did bring this up, that none of them would have had any idea that Patrick Pearse, the school teacher, who became, at the heart of the Irish Revolution in 1916. We went into Patrick Pearse in episode 18, and we'll be going into Patrick Pearse again, I'm sure. He cared very much about English education in Ireland. He called it a murder machine because he saw this English education was foisting a materialism on Irish children. But these kinds of issues of materialistic British education or destroying the Irish language, these days people are sort of being indoctrinated into interpreting everything through an economic lens, or, a subtly Marxist lens, where all that really matters is economics and the means of production. It's not that Irish Catholics cared about things like the faith, or cared about things like the culture, or cared about things like the language, the Irish language. No, what they cared about was Marxist oppression. Sorry, about what oppression, what Marxists would speak economic exploitation. Jack participates in a dominant mainstream narrative, where, yes, economic exploitation is a terrible thing. And Marx was right that capitalism was doing terrible things to people. And the Irish certainly suffered that very deeply indeed. But if you have a storyline where what happened in Ireland is, just about Marxism and socialism, and you have no idea about the culture and about the faith, you are being very much deceived and impoverished by the mainstream materialistic narrative. So that's just one little story that emerged. And I'm struck by the word indoctrinated because, because Jack is friendly to the ideas of the Enlightenment, or Jack is, friendly to the ideas of Freud. Jack is very concerned with, shaming people or judging people, because of sexuality or whatever. All of this descends through Freud. There's a whole current that we have thanks to Freud that, all kinds of sexual behavior is fine. And, guilt is just something neurotic. Whether Freud actually spells all this out completely or not in every way, shape, or form that's relevant to our modern culture, the children of Freud, so to speak, have certainly contributed to this. All of this is like common sense for Jack. He's embraced these ideas. Therefore, he's not indoctrinated in him. The one that's alien to him, Christianity being alien, that's indoctrination. That's indoctrination. But the ones that have been utterly unconsciously absorbed and taken on, that's not indoctrination. I fear sounding so superior to these people, and it's hard to know how to speak about them because I respect a kind of basic idealism that I find there. Now, I have to confess that the idealism seems to me programmed by the dominant narratives of, the mainstream media, whether it's the BBC in England or RTE, the Irish broadcaster here in Ireland. So these people, are striving for ideals, whether it's, to maybe ascetic ideals, to give up meat, because of climate change and become vegan, or all kinds of things. And there is a certain kind of moral effort there. And I'm not denying climate change. I certainly deny very much what, so to speak, the New World Order says we should do about climate change. But climate change needs to be taken very, very seriously indeed. Unfortunately, many, many, many other things need to be taken very seriously indeed. And what I encountered in this gathering was one where the ethical ideas were simply like carbon copies of what the mainstream media tells you you should care about. So, yes, you should convert to plant-based foods and this and that and so on and so forth. I'm close to being vegetarian myself. I don't really have issues with that. What I have issues with is people's ethics being shaped by the BBC with, it seems, little idea of where the ideology of the BBC comes from. And then there's a kind of, if I'm sounding superior, from the other side, there was a corresponding superior. So very occasionally in this gathering, flashes of Catholicism came up. My wife, Kim, raised the idea of the saints whose bodies after death are incorruptible. They have not corrupted. After investigation by the Vatican, one of the miracles in establishing sainthood. And that kind of idea is met by instant negation, instant suspicion. Well, along the lines of maybe the Vatican has done something special to, preserve these bodies and hoodwink people. A whole suspicion of Catholicism is very deeply in the bedrock of the British people. And there were British participants, as I've indicated, at this gathering. And maybe I should also say that, I know some of the people here before. I've met them before. And I know that there is a whole, culture of superiority. I, Roger, and my wife have fallen into, something backwards. Loads of my listeners will have experiences like this. Many of you may have it every day in your office or workplace, although maybe it will be more muted. The currents there as what I experienced this weekend. Very hard to talk about it, but what I really want to get at is not more of the details here, but how it's affected me. As I say, I know these things through and through and through. I know them in my head, but how much do I really know them in my heart? If I know them in my heart, I won't rant, about it. I will simply, I think, weep in my heart. Not necessarily tears, but weep in my heart that people are so trapped. I mean, it goes without saying here that in addition to, suspicion that, the saints' bodies have been artificially preserved, there's suspicion about all nature of transcendent things and a kind of hip trendiness in disbelieving in any kind of afterlife, like, I'm strong and powerful because I know we only have this one life, and you are weak, and you need your crutch. To believe in an afterlife. It would be easy to rant about these things, but what is it to really feel? That people are trapped in a world with nothing transcendent. And there's an individual level of tragedy here, an individual level where this is bound to breed cynicism, ennui, hopelessness for the individuals concerned. But of course, we're not just speaking about individuals. We're speaking about an entire capitalist culture. Because in a culture where this life matters and nothing else matters, it's inevitable that sexuality, including distortions of sexuality, the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of material things, this is what's causing climate change. This is what's, threatening to burn the planet up. The fact that we have a culture of materialism that denies or marginalizes, at very least marginalizes the transcendent, marginalizes God, marginalizes our Saviour, Jesus Christ. I could say much more about the details of this gathering. What I want to get at here is that it's produced a feeling of greater awakeness to what I already know. So I know children are starving, but here it's like having the starving child of modern culture thrust into my arms and staring down at its impoverished, emaciated form. It's like really jolted me in some way, friends, and that's what I really want to try to capture. There are these transition points, and I often, I've said this before in episodes, I often feel them when I transit from one culture to another. So in episode 22, where I was speaking about travels in France, I spoke about coming from Paris and going to Dublin. And even though Paris is far bigger than Dublin, I was jolted by the sheer capitalism and commercialism of Dublin compared to Paris. It hit me. And I was in Dublin as well, I'm not that often in Dublin, feeling how Dublin had become, a capitalist commercial culture, very much like, London or New York. Not as big, but with the same kind of screaming, blaring materialism. And it jolted me to see that Paris wasn't the same, and it jolted me to remember that just a few decades ago, Dublin would have been completely different. Yes, people would have been much poorer, and I don't know what it's like to be that poor. But there would have been masses and prayers and devotion and piety. In fact, I've been speaking about Rudolf Steiner on this channel. I didn't know I was going to say this, but it's just here now. One of the disciples of Rudolf Steiner, who was completely hostile to Catholicism, traveled a fair amount around Europe. And he came to Dublin. And this was being, I'm guessing 1920, 1925. And he described Dublin, in his experience, as the holiest city in all of Europe. We may go into that another time. I personally believe that this disciple of Steiner's was a very, very sensitive soul. I think that when he described Dublin as the holiest city that he'd seen in Europe, this is something against his whole grain for an anthroposophist to say something like this. When he said something like that, it was because he felt something in Dublin. And I think what he would have felt is the prayers, the piety, the devotion, the masses, the people of Dublin in some way calling out to Christ and supplicating Our Lady with rosary after rosary after rosary. I do actually think that Steiner's spiritual exercises can and do serve to sensitize people. He was British, this disciple. He knew Britain very well, and I think that the contrast between Ireland supplicating Our Lady, calling out to Christ, would have hit him very deeply, even though, as an anthroposophist, he would have been completely steeped in, again, all of Steiner's anti-Catholicism. And 100 years later, I come back from Paris to Dublin, and all I'm seeing is this kind of screaming, blaring materialism, and I feel in my heart how much the Irish have lost. Here in rural northwest Ireland, I can still see the Ireland that existed. But anyway, I digress, friends, I digress. I've just gone through another kind of jolting transition, just thrown out of my usual world into another world, and I'm trying to digest what it means. It's like I'm looking at a world that is like a herd mentality. It is indoctrinated. People are conditioned in their ethics. They just form major group movements based on what, the BBC, the RTE, the British, because Ireland, mainly reads, well, maybe not mainly, but it certainly does read a lot of the British press. And you could argue that the Irish press now is very much a copy of the British press. I'm somehow here weeping inside for a culture. I'm not sure culture is the word. But anyway, a society just herded along by the dominant narratives in the Anglo-American capitalist media and in its imitators in the Irish media. I mean, just an aside here, you could certainly argue that it's not just the Irish media that are like copycats of the Anglo-American media. The Irish political elites now are copycats of the Anglo-American political elites. I think so. The former Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkhar, who managed to initiate abortion in Ireland in 2018, so that Ireland, 50 years after the British initiated killing the unborn in 1967, finally in 2018, this was pushed through in Ireland, thanks to people like Leo Varadkar. And I have to say, I see a real kind of copycat mentality in Varadkar. I mean, on a less serious, but still serious level than killing the unborn. I noticed that Leo Varadkar, after the kind of politically correct liberal elements in American society began pulling down statues that were deemed inappropriate in America, and then you even had kind of copycats of that existing in England. Leo Varadkar said words to the effect like, "We need to have a serious discussion about this," something like that, about taking down Irish statues as well. Just a kind of herd wave of copying. I mean, I was grateful at the time to see that the French president, Emmanuel Macron, certainly a progressive, he made it very clear we're not going to start taking down statues in France. France, even as I said, as I've been speaking about in recent episodes about France, even the French left is up in arms about American political correctness destroying their culture. But it seems that Irish elites, political elites, media elites are happy to sort of follow the lead of American political correctness here. All of this is a far cry from Irish political leaders in the past, like Eamon de Valera or Patrick Pearse, the leader of the revolution that we mentioned and whom we went into in episode 18 and whom we're certainly coming back to. Say what you will about people like Pearse or de Valera, but they were motivated by something higher than simply copying things like American political correctness. Patrick Pearse, school teacher, was sensitive to materialism in the British education in Ireland that he thought was murdering children's souls. This was his own kind of original insight. It wasn't a sort of copycat performance. And based on concerns, again, for the culture, the language, the faith, Ireland once sought to be different from the, Anglo-American world that it tended to look at as materialistic. Anyway, a lot more can be said about that. I'm not sure that we should be rehearsing that all now. We will be returning to it. It's like the real question right now is what do I do with this feeling of horror? And the only answer I have is to try to be as serious as possible. I mean, something else I said in that earlier episode 22, where I'm speaking about traveling through France, I speak about an experience that I had in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and I'm saying that the same thing was impressed on me, a sense of how unserious I am, such that after that experience in Notre Dame, this was just before Notre Dame burned, I went straight to confession to say to the priest that I am not serious enough. One needs to pray, one needs to act. In my case, my actions come out of praying to God, what do I most need to do with my life in whatever remaining years I have left? And it occurs to me as I pray about this, didn't know I was going to say this either, but it occurs to me as I pray about this that the Lord has providentially given me experiences I need to work with. So I have been given years of insight into Ireland, into Irish Catholicism, in a way that I can hopefully begin to speak about it at least a little. I am entirely unqualified to speak about Polish Catholicism. Or I have all these years of experience of the New Age, and that qualifies me to speak about the New Age, because, as I say in my books, particularly the last Gentle Traditionalist book, this modern world has two religions. One religion I call the New Secular Religion, or the Gentle Traditionalist calls this the New Secular Religion, and this is for, the kind of people that I encountered this weekend. Materialists who believe that there is no other life than this one, but they had better follow the ethical injunctions of the BBC and become vegan or whatever, and eat plant-based food. But look, I'm not actually trying to sneer at veganism, because if you make significant sacrifices in your diet out of compassion for the cruelty suffered by animals, that is a special and beautiful thing. Compassion is always beautiful. What I'm really getting at here, though, is the way these ideals are being inculcated, because we're not being inculcated in compassion for the slaughter of the unborn. We're being inculcated in compassion for animals. But I have the most deep respect for anyone who sacrifices themselves for a higher ideal. I am just very, very concerned about how these ideals are being sort of inculcated by the media, who selectively omit issues like the unborn, while all the time pointing to what we have to do, supposedly, about climate change, while all the time ignoring our massive capitalist civilization that is what has produced climate change, and proposing that we continue with capitalism as usual. It's staggering. But again, this is what the Gentle Traditionalist speaks about as a new secular religion. And that sort of new secular religion has all kinds of injunctions, whether it's thou shalt not shame people, or thou shalt not judge people, or thou shalt not smoke, or whatever. It's working as a de facto religion. That's what the Gentle Traditionalist is saying. But the Gentle Traditionalist and the Gentle Traditionalist books is saying that for those people in the sort of secular culture who cannot completely buy materialism, for those people, there's another religion. It's the New Age religion. And it's a religion about not judging, not shaming, all these kinds of liberal values, but it still, posits a transcendent order, because some people, I think, are incapable of becoming completely materialistic. So the Gentle Traditionalist is suggesting that we need an alternative. We need a New Age religion for these people, for those people who will never become true, complete materialists. And this is the person I was, ladies and gentlemen, when I was young. I had the sort of secular orientation, certainly, but I could never be a true materialist. This is why I gravitated to the New Age movement. There's a lot of people who think the New Age movement is only about the occult, but what I want to suggest that it is, above all, is a sort of form of anodyne spirituality. Anodyne. it doesn't make huge demands on you. You can sort of believe in some vague transcendent, life force or God. You can sort of make up your own kind of rituals and things like that, but nothing is ever demanded of you. This is what I'm saying in the New Age episodes, that we sometimes confuse the New Age if we think it's, purely about, dangerous or occult or magical rituals. In my experience, the New Age is more about the search for an anodyne, liberal spirituality that suits the modern world. And that's what my character in these dialogues, gentle traditionalist books that are mainly dialogues, is saying. It's like, to manage our society, we need two new religions. We need the new secular religion with all its ethical injunctions to manage the people so that they follow these materialistic molds, and we need a new age religion for those people who can't quite fully buy materialism. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not my normal episode at all. Most of my episodes are far more fully prepared. I really don't have time. I don't have time right now to do the kind of camera episode with all the editing and all the work that goes into it, work that just takes me often weeks. I thought I would try a voice episode, and I thought that I would try to do it in a day. I might just be succeeding. I may actually do this episode in only one day. Very spontaneous, very unscripted. But there's one last set of ideas that I want to bring in here. I've been speaking a lot about Valentin Tomberg in the last couple of episodes, so much so that the last episode, 35, might seem not that easy for people who don't know Tomberg. I want to say that the last episode, episode 35, which is called Through Christendom with Tomberg, actually contains a great deal that is very important to this channel and the work that I'm trying to do. There's a lot in there about France, about Ireland, about Britain, about the modern liberal order. For those of you who might be interested, who aren't interested in my Tomberg videos, I want to particularly point to episode 35 and say, you might want to skip the first half hour, skip the first 40 minutes. But after the first half hour or 40 minutes, I go into a great deal about my journey through Ireland, through Britain, through France, through Europe, a journey that has formed everything I'm saying. It's a very personal episode. It's not just about Tomberg. I also say on that episode that I'm trying now to work with two different audiences, people who know Tomberg and people who don't. But I want to say very clearly that Tomberg was gravely concerned about all the things that I'm speaking to you about. In fact, arguably more than anyone else, I owe this critique of materialism to Tomberg. I should say, to give credit where credit is due, I should say that I also owe it to Rudolf Steiner, who came before Tomberg. And I just want to say something about Steiner here. Somehow, while I was going through, this gathering, morning, noon, and night, day after day, immersion in materialism, and in a certain sense, weeping in my heart, I couldn't help but think of Steiner. Because when I was younger, I have read lecture after lecture after lecture after lecture after lecture of Steiner warning the world about the plunge into materialism. And Steiner can be uncannily prophetic. He actually says that unless something is done, for example, he says something like this, 2/3 through the 20th century, so he means the 1960s, he suggests that all kinds of sexual perversity will begin to break out. And maybe we should add that Steiner died in 1925, so of course that's long before the 1960s. Whatever Steiner was, he could be, as far as I can see, incredibly prophetic. I want to honor that in Steiner, and there's something else I want to honor. This sense of horror, of materialism, points to something very noble in Steiner as far as I can see, and he has educated me through that sense of deeply held horror that he has. Obviously, Steiner isn't the only person who had a great sense of horror for materialism. I'm deeply, deeply, deeply indebted to Hilaire Belloc in that way. In fact, that is a way that I feel closer to Belloc than Chesterton. Chesterton has different gifts and different glories, but there's something sweeter and sunnier in his temperament, and I don't know if he fully got to grips with the horror of the modern trajectory in the way Belloc did. And of course, there are other people. I think I'm just going to actually give a shout out to Aroka Press again and their republication of Carol Robinson. There is a great American Catholic who also feels the horror of modern growing materialism and capitalism in a way that's very, very acute. I think she can do great things for Americans. So I salute Aroka Press for bringing those books back out. I think I'll put a link down below. I hope at some point to do a video about Carol Robinson. But right now, what's really come up for me this weekend, this gathering, is that I just was jolted by very much the kinds of things that Steiner so prophetically warned about and felt so deeply and keenly in his heart. I'm not going to go into a huge examination of Steiner at all right now. That's in other episodes. But I want to sort of invoke that while I was in this gathering of materialism, while I was immersed in it, I just couldn't help but feel my debt to Steiner. Sometimes I feel that on the first episode about him, particularly, that I was occasionally too harsh to the anthroposophists. Now, anthroposophy is a system of thinking that is hostile to the church. That cannot be denied. It is incredibly problematic, for the church in all kinds of ways. But this was Steiner's position as far as I can see it. He could see the life of humanity falling century by century, generation by generation, decade by decade, into greater materialism of the kind that I'm talking about in this episode. He came, it's tragic, but he came to the belief that faith and the church could no longer lead people to Christ. So he came to this system of belief, system of interior meditative work. I can't do better justice to it right now. This is a very brief aside regarding Steiner. See my other episodes if you're interested. But he came to this grandiose hope of replacing the church with anthroposophy and leading people to Christ by a different route. There is something immensely tragic in what Steiner was proposing, but nonetheless his heart was weeping for the materialism of the modern world, for a world losing Christ. And as I say, I have to give credit where credit is due. In my youth, Rudolf Steiner, helped me to break away from the New Age, break away from the Findhorn mentality that I had. So much is going on in me, ladies and gentlemen. I didn't know I was going to attempt this strange audio episode today, but I'm seeing that this is my life. What happened to me in the cathedral at Notre Dame, where I simply felt like I was not being serious enough, not using my gifts enough. I speak about this in episode 22. All of these things are things that have been given to me, including Steiner's penetrating account of the rise of world materialism over the last centuries. So I think we're actually going to finish, ladies and gentlemen, finish soon. Not my normal kind of episode. Usually I want to spend a lot more time on these episodes, really planning what I'm going to say, if not exactly scripting them, thinking things out here. I'm sure I've said some things that are too sloppy, but for once, we're not going to try to fix them. I just somehow wanted to give you this burst of pain and burst of passion, and I hope burst with some kind of prayerfulness in it, to tell you what this gathering imparted to me, and to sort of tell you a little bit about where we are going on this channel. What Tomberg is doing, as far as I can see, having pondered his work now for 25 years, is taking on some of what Steiner suggested in order to counter the growth of world materialism. But he's saying this should not happen separately from the church, or with attitudes of hostility to the church. What I see Tomberg doing in his immense Catholic work in the 60s, Meditations on the Tarot, but also Lazarus Come Forth, and also his works of Catholic jurisprudence written earlier, is trying to suggest a way forward for modern culture to combat materialism, a way forward that is humble and devoted to the church. I see an initiative or a project in Tomberg's Catholic works, and I am also going to mention, this is kind of like a bulletin of what we're going to be going more into in the future. I'm deeply concerned, very deeply concerned indeed, that Tomberg's legacy is being misread and mishandled because people are failing to separate Tomberg the Catholic from Tomberg the anthroposophist, the anthroposophy that he renounced again and again and again and again and again in his writings. There is this renunciation of anthroposophy and this encouragement of being a faithful and obedient son of the church. Tomberg is proposing a way forward through the growing and deepening and materialism of our age, and I need to speak more about this in future episodes. This is just a little indication I want to make of what I have increasingly come to see in these Catholic books, that they are not just books, but they form part of a project or initiative that Tomberg was suggesting to bring healing to the modern schizophrenic condition of materialism. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's some weeks later now, and I need to make some self-corrections or self-contradictions because we're not nearly finished. I need to say a few things more. Also, obviously, my plan to see if I could do an entire episode in one single day has failed, because I'm saying more now, but also I was hoping not to fix the episode, and there are a few small fixes and edits in what you just heard. I seem to be incorrigible in the care that I need to take in these episodes, and I'm saying that for reasons that will get clearer by the end of the episode. But right now, we have two sort of last things that I want to go into, slowly go into. I need to say a bit more about what I am suggesting as Tomberg's project or program to bring some kind of healing to the madness of materialism in the modern West. A few more notes are needed about that, I feel, or would be good about that. And at the end, after that, after the Tomberg stuff, you can just skip ahead if you're not so into the Tomberg stuff. I want to make a few personal announcements. These are not my usual announcements about where you can buy my books or whatever. No. I dare to think that there is a growing community of people interested in this channel as a whole, and if you are one of those people, you might be interested in my more personal announcements. But first, let me say some things about Tomberg and the madness of the West. I think I'm going to start by saying that if Tomberg were alive today, and he saw what I mentioned earlier in the episode about Leo Varadkhar, suddenly, out of nowhere, 2020 or whatever it is, saying, we need to have a serious conversation, about pulling down statues. People weren't needing to have serious conversations about this in 2010 or 2000 or 1990 or 1980. No. As far as I can see, there is this massive collective wave coming out of certain segments of American society in this particular case, which is not to say that there aren't massive collective waves coming out of other societies. And suddenly, Leo Varadkhar thinks he needs to jump on board. I think if Tomberg were alive today, he would see this as a wave of collective psychosis. And the collective psychosis is based on a deeper level of madness, because Tomberg, would also suggest that materialism is a form of madness. Now, in this episode, we brought up Freud a lot, because Freud had an answer, supposedly, to mental illness. And, very briefly and crudely put, Freud located neurosis in, the repressed libido, repressed sexuality. Now, I think that madness is about something far, far deeper than repressed libido, obviously. And Tomberg did too. And I think it's, given that we brought Freud into this episode, speaking about madness, it would be good to bring in Carl Gustav Jung, who began as Freud's pupil, but who broke away from Freud. Because Tomberg, in addition to working, with the non-Catholic Steiner, is also working with other thinkers, non-Christian thinkers at times, including Jung. And I want to just, before we go forward, this is a way of, illustrating Tomberg's program for bringing healing to the West. I want to read you something briefly that Tomberg says about Freud, says about Marx, and then says about Jung. So this is from Meditations on the Tarot, and it relates to everything we've been saying in the episode. So here we go. Here's Tomberg. Just as Karl Marx, being impressed by the partial truth reduced to its simplest basis, that it is first necessary to eat in order to be able to think, raised the economic interest to that's on capital letters, the principle of man and the history of civilization, so Sigmund Freud, being impressed by the partial truth that it is first necessary to be born in order to be able to eat and to think, and that sexual desire is necessary for birth, raised this latter to the principle of man and the whole of human culture. So Tomberg is suggesting that, and this is the basis of a heresy. A heresy is always, based on a partial truth. Tomberg is pointing out that Marx and Freud have an overemphasis on things that are partially true. And he goes on to say, as Marx saw Homo economicus, economic man, at the basis of Homo sapiens, so Freud saw Homo sexualis, sexual man, at the basis of Homo sapiens. He then goes into a little bit about another depth psychologist, Alfred Adler, who disagreed with Freud, saying it's not sex that's it's all about, it's about the human will to power. But we'll pass over that. But I want to come to what Tomberg says about Jung, and we're bringing this up to make a greater point. However, Carl Gustav Jung, whilst admitting the partial truth of the doctrines of Freud and Adler, was led by his clinical experience to the discovery of a much deeper layer of the psyche than that studied by Freud and Adler. He had to admit the reality of a religious layer, which lies at a much greater depth than the layers of sex and of the will to power. Thus, thanks to the work of Jung, man is fundamentally homo religiosus, a religious being. And then he goes on to say that Jung discovered the divine breath at the core of the human being. Now, you may find this funny that he discovered it, because, of course, Catholics and Christians have known this all along. But all these people began as materialists, people deeply, deeply steeped in the materialism of the Enlightenment. And one thing that Tomberg is doing here with Jung is to give him credit where credit is due. You know, we live in a world now where everything is being reduced to sexuality. You know, the cultural Freudianism that I've been speaking of, or is being reduced, simply to economics. And what Tomberg is saying here is Jung, at very least, is pointing to something higher and transcendent to these things, that the human being is a religious being. Now, clearly, Jung was a pagan. He was not a Christian. So Steiner was a Christian. Jung could not even get as far as Christianity. And Tomberg very much expresses that, he laments that Jung could not go further, could not reach Christianity. That's at least that's the way I'm reading Tomberg. But nonetheless, this is a step. Psychotherapy has been raised away from interpreting everything as sex, the way that Freud did. It's not far enough. It's nowhere near going far enough. It's not going as far as the church and Christianity, but at least it's a step in the right direction. And in the course of the book, Tomberg uses certain insights from Jung. Jung was very concerned with the phenomenon of psychological inflation or psychological grandiosity, whereby people became basically very, very arrogant. They came to believe that they were Superman. They focused all their attention on themselves. And Jung was working in ways to try to heal psychological inflation and psychological grandiosity. And this is definitely relevant to things that we're going to on this channel. But I'm just going to give you a little personal aside, ladies and gentlemen. Before I became a Catholic, I was in Jungian analysis. I was in Jungian analysis with something like 80 years old, an old man, a Jungian, who had also been trained in Zurich, in Switzerland, by one of the students of Jung. And this old man, I think, really challenged my New Ageism. He challenged my inflation, my grandiosity, because this is one of the points I'm making in everything I'm saying about the New Age, and a lot of, so-called alternative spiritualities, is that they do lead to, or they can lead to tremendous grandiosity, arrogance, or in the language of debt psychology, inflation. And maybe I also throw into the pot here that this particular Jungian analyst that I had was also a devout Christian. He was actually an Anglican minister, an Anglican vicar. I'm afraid I can no longer say Anglican priest, because through painful processes over the years, I came to see what the church, both Catholic and Orthodox teaches, that the sacraments are not present, at least not present in the same way in the Anglican Church. And I agree, I take on the understanding of the Catholic and Orthodox churches that you can't call a Protestant minister a priest. But nonetheless, this analyst, of mine was a devout Christian. He was a devout Christian who was also a Jungian. And he was the first really devout Christian, well, almost the first anyway, that I had ever really met. And he was very deeply impressed by the nature of the fall. And in some opening way, he helped open me, this Jungian analyst, to Christianity, for which I am forever grateful. I'm digressing personally, this is the subject of another time. But anyway, yes, this devout Anglican minister had found value in Jung, so much so that he had gone to Zurich and trained with one of Jung's students. And this is really where Tomberg is coming from. Things that are not Christian can have value if they are Christianized. So Tomberg's argument in his books is that the early Christians could see tremendous value in Plato, could see tremendous value in Aristotle, and he suggests that they baptized Plato and Aristotle. Aquinas baptized Aristotle. And Tomberg is saying that there are certain things now that are happening outside of the church. Born in the terrible environment of materialism. Jung, again, was a disciple of Freud, who broke free of Freud. Tomberg, again, laments, the fact that Jung could not go further. But at least he got to, no, we're not just all, neurotic or mad because, we've repressed our sexuality or our libido. He offered a higher and more transcendent vision. And Tomberg is saying, let us give credit where credit is due. I'm very aware that I might have certain Catholics saying, well, why do you need all this? You've got the sacraments. Why do you need psychotherapy? I want to say straight away that the sacraments have given me far, far, far more than anything I ever got from Jungian analysis. Nonetheless, Tomberg is writing a book, or writing books, that bring in many different influences and is seeking to redeem them and to Christianize them. And I felt that in this episode where we're speaking about the madness of materialism, or things like the collective psychosis that, I see at least Leo Varadkhar buying into, saying, we need to start, copying, the Americans, or these are elements of American society, pulled along in a vast herd movement. Jung had a lot to say about collective psychosis, and in Tomberg's view, it's valuable. We can go into this another time. I see terrible collective psychosis on both sides of this terrible war that we're in at the moment. I really can't speak to this. I can't speak to this now. I can't speak to this now, but I am convinced, without taking any sides, that in the terrible propaganda going on from the Russian side and going on from the NATO side, yes, Russia is the aggressor here, but there is dreadful propaganda going on both sides as far as I can see, and there is a kind of collective psychosis going on here as well. And just as the church became aware that Plato and Aristotle had things to offer. Tomberg is arguing that when it comes to understanding modern madness and madness of materialism, certain insights from people like Jung can actually correct Freud. This is the subject of further episodes to come, I think, really, but it's an example of something that I want to open out to you. I see Tomberg's work as, again, a project or a program. As I've been suggesting in the recent episodes on Tomberg, that program or project has a philosophical dimension, it has an ecclesiastical dimension, it has a psychological dimension, it has a political dimension. But given that we've been speaking about Freud here, I somehow thought that I would say more about the psychological dimension of Tomberg, because so far I've just been really focused a great deal on both Tomberg's continuity with Steiner and Tomberg's rupture and radical discontinuity with Steiner. In fact, I would go so far as to say that just like Jung broke with Freud, but nonetheless retained certain elements of psychotherapy, there is an analogy there between Tomberg and Steiner. Tomberg breaks with Steiner, but there are, as I say, significant continuities as well. But for Tomberg, lest some of my Catholic listeners, as I say, I'm speaking to two kinds of audience these days. I'm speaking to certain people reading Tomberg who are where I used to be. They haven't followed Tomberg into the church. So I'm trying to speak to these two different audiences, and it's tough. It's tough. But what do I want to say here? I want to say that we've been focused so far largely on Tomberg and Steiner because Tomberg was an anthroposophist before he converted to the church, and that's a huge part of understanding Tomberg. But there are other elements in the whole mix here as well, including C.G. Jung. And at the same time, I want to say, and this is relevant to where we're going in the future, this whole issue of psychological inflation is very important. It's something that I now see that I suffered from very much as a result of the New Age, as a result of so-called alternative spiritualities, that they serve to sort of puff up my ego, make me believe that I was better than other people. That's something that Tomberg is very, very gravely concerned about in his work, this tendency of alternative spirituality to puff up the ego and create psychological grandiosity. There's going to be a lot more to say on that. These are really sort of bulletins, advanced notices of where I want to head further in further videos about Tomberg to come, where I'm speaking about Tomberg's continuities with people like Steiner or Jung, but I want to leave no one in doubt here. Tomberg has radically broken with Steiner. And I'm going to just finish this whole thing now with one more quote from Tomberg that really says it all in terms of this, I think. Here we go. This is from Lazarus Come Forth. The shepherd of the church is Saint Peter, representing Christ. His pronouncements ex cathedra are infallible, and the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven belongs to him and him alone. It's quite a statement for an ex-anthroposophist to say the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven belongs to him and him alone. This is light years, several galaxies removed from anything that Rudolf Steiner could ever conceive. And then he goes on in the same paragraph to say, those who become solitary in order to seek profundity may reach on their path of spiritual experience to the unshakable insight that the dogmas of the church are absolutely true. So, Tomberg's project or program does have this psychological dimension to it, combating spiritual grandiosity, combating arrogance, but it's absolutely married to the church. Tomberg knows the incredible importance of the sacraments, including the sacrament of penance. I say again, nothing I ever got from Jungian analysis can equal what I have found through the sacraments, the Mass, and the sacrament of confession, which I go to regularly. Hang on, I need to make a correction. I just said that everything I got from Jungian analysis cannot equal what I have received through the sacraments. Friends, it is far more than that. I got so much from my 2 years of Jungian analysis with that wise old man, but it doesn't come even remotely close to what I have received through the sacraments. You know, that wise old man helped to alert me to my inflation, but the sacrament of penance, the sacrament of the Mass, hopefully, I am a little bit less inflated now, and it is thanks to the sacraments above all, far more than psychotherapy. So I want to make that emphatic. And I also want to say something else. These are sort of bulletins for the future, really, but I want to note it in passing. I think part of the divide between the people reading Tomberg who are Catholic or who have converted to Catholicism, like I have, and those who have not, is that those who have not, while sometimes they might be sympathetic to Catholicism, they can't really understand what Tomberg was going through in the second half of his life. You know, he speaks about the Mass shaking him in the innermost core of his being. It's very difficult for a non-Catholic to understand these things. Someone like myself, who has been through the New Age, who has been through alternative spirituality, who has been through Jungian analysis, and just realizes that none of this, you know, can compare to what I'm experiencing with the sacraments, will inevitably see Tomberg in a different way and understand Tomberg in a different way than those who are reading him who are not participating in the sacraments. And to be frank, I do see certain problems with various commentaries on Tomberg written by people, good people, who, you know, are not having this experience. You know, they either gloss over, they tend to gloss over the Catholicism as far as I'm concerned. So, for example, you know, the thing we just spoke about, coming to know that the dogmas of the church are absolutely true, and Peter, I mean, obviously that includes the dogma, the Catholic dogma of ex cathedra papal infallibility. This is very, very difficult for non-Catholics, very difficult. And so, you know, there's often a tendency to gloss over these aspects of Tomberg's thinking, and inevitably Tomberg's thinking will get distorted by that glossing over. I think to really understand Tomberg, what Tomberg was in the second half of his life, I'm not sure you really can understand it without being immersed in the sacraments of the Mass, sacrament of confession. Tomberg speaks, you know, as though, you know, these people are Hermeticists, you know, today we might say representatives of alternative spirituality. He says they nearly all suffer incredible psychological inflation and grandiosity. One wonders, reading him, if he's speaking about himself. And, you know, in his private correspondence, he speaks about going to confession. You know, he actually criticizes the anthroposophists for not having confession. Tomberg was experiencing the power of the Catholic sacraments, and commentators who are not experiencing that power, in my view, while they have very good intentions and maybe very good insights in many aspects of his wide-ranging thinking, they're inevitably going to miss something here. Anyway, as I say, these are really just bulletins for the future. I now really want to turn to some rather personal things and personal announcements about the future of this channel and this work. I feel like I'm beginning a new phase that is aiming at a greater online presence than before. And in doing that, frankly, I'm going against what I said just some weeks ago at the beginning of this episode. Because, I spent some time at the beginning of this episode really suggesting that spending too much time online could be contributing to the mental breakdown of the world. And I mean that quite seriously. I'm really disturbed. I feel like global mental health is breaking down, and I feel like the faster and faster back and forth communications of social media have a real role to play in that. Nonetheless, I'm resolving on taking some steps towards some things that I have formerly resisted. The first and probably least important of all is that I am actually now properly on Twitter. I'll give you a Twitter link down below. What do I mean properly? I mean that I've had a Twitter account in years past, but nearly all the tweets were auto-generated by a system that someone set up for me. I am now, instead of auto-generating tweets, consciously writing tweets. It's very strange for me. Now, I will tell you, I have shut off the comments on the tweets because I'm really not sure that anyone can have a meaningful dialogue when reduced to sound bites, and I'm aware of all kinds of things like Twitter wars, but if anyone just wants to hear tweets from me, you can find me on Twitter. More importantly, I'm now starting something on this YouTube channel that I hope will enrich people's experience of the channel. There's a section for community posts, and I have started posting in that section. Some of you have noticed it already and are commenting. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm even trying to respond to comments both at the community posts and the YouTube videos a bit more rapidly than I have in the past. Now, I still don't want to sort of join in creating a culture where people feel guilty for not getting back to people at top speed or feel slighted if someone doesn't get back to you for a few days. I think this culture is hurting people. But at least as an experiment, I've decided to go more out there in terms of talking to people, and I hope these new community posts, as I say, will enrich the channel. I intend there to sort of be foreshadowing certain places where I think this channel is going, because it is growing and developing. I've obviously just been talking about Tomberg, but some of the earlier things I said about Patrick Pearse, about Ireland, that's definitely an indication of where I want to go on this channel. How should I say this, ladies and gentlemen? One of my reasons for being so reticent in getting into back and forth things on social media is that I have felt actually almost desperate. Maybe people won't believe me, but desperate to resolve certain almost tortuous questions inside of myself. Tough questions about the church, why the church is in the state it's in, the world, questions about controversies or controversial figures like I've already been invoking here, like Tomberg or Belloc or indeed Patrick Pearse, Emil de Valera. More is going to be said about that. What really truly happened to Ireland? And for me, these kinds of questions are not the kinds of questions for which there are any easy, pat answers. I can't find answers to these questions by sort of going onto YouTube and listening to some kind of YouTube groupthink. It needs to be wrestled with and struggled with in myself through processes of prayer, through processes of thinking, through processes of research. But I think I'm now in a process, ladies and gentlemen, where I feel like I've turned a corner. Having gone through a lot, I think I'm becoming more ready to go out there and speak on the subject of some of these controversial matters. More ready than ever. And I hope to say things that are not just pat answers or groupthink, but are actually original. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I think the things that I say on this channel that really have any value are the things that are original. If I'm just sort of parroting Catholic traditionalist groupthink, I don't really think I'm serving anyone. But if I have something original to say that especially comes from prayer and comes from the heart, hopefully I can make some kind of small difference in this world. But what I've found in terms of whatever original things I have to say is that they are born from really quite intense processes of searching, as I say, sometimes tortuous searching, prayer. I don't, I've been speaking on the channel recently, or not so long ago, about wariness of groupthink everywhere, whether it's mainstream, Western propaganda groupthink, whether it's Russian propaganda groupthink, whether it's, New Age groupthink, whether it's anthroposophical groupthink, or, yes, whether it's, I think some of the groupthink that is maybe coming out of some of the major American YouTube Catholic channels. I am very wary of this, and I'm increasingly alarmed. I'm increasingly alarmed that some of these YouTube big channels where the content creator may be very, very sincere, but I am worried. I am worried that almost like an alternative hierarchy in the church is being created, that Catholics are now being formed by some of these very, very major, and yeah, usually they're American, Catholic YouTube stars. It troubles me, which is why I did the episode on Taylor Marshall, not to, dig at Taylor Marshall personally. I'm sure he's a very sincere Catholic, but the phenomenon. So that episode was about him, sort of just one instance of him where he ended up, almost, in my view, condemning the Institute of Christ the King and the Fraternity of St. Peter because they weren't, didn't have hair on their chests, weren't standing up, as he thought they should, to the Pope, resisting the Pope over Traditionis Custodes. And I had to say that I feel far more wisdom coming out of the Institute of Christ the King, and also far more Catholicity coming out of the Institute of Christ the King than I do out of this, I sometimes call it alternative YouTube Catholic hierarchy. And I think part of the problem here, ladies and gentlemen, is that in order to succeed on YouTube, the YouTube algorithm on YouTube rewards you if you post more often. You're told if you want to succeed on YouTube, you have to post, ideally every single day. And if not that, at least once a week. But that comes with a price, ladies and gentlemen. It comes with a price, I think, of frequent mediocrity. Because who really has something original to say that's deep and thoughtful every single day? Now, this is part of the problem I see with this alternative YouTube hierarchy. Everything is just going faster and faster. Zing, 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 zing. And I fear that it's rooted in a very 21st century Catholicism, which may have less to do with the roots of Catholicism in the past and more than anyone realizes, perhaps, to do with things like clickbait or jumping to the Google algorithm. I mean, this is one of the things I said in the video, I think it's episode 30 that I did on Taylor Marshall, except I didn't do it on Taylor Marshall because I know very little about Taylor Marshall. I did it on this one instance where Taylor Marshall was, it seemed to me almost calling the Institute, the fraternity, cowards in his view. Maybe he didn't use that word, but that seemed implicit in his words. And that's what that episode was about. And one of the things I actually tried to say on that episode is that I just feared that Taylor Marshall was moving too fast. It's very difficult to have wisdom when you are moving at that kind of speed. I'm no authority on this, but I'm under the impression that Monsignor Vac of the Institute of Christ the King, you can't take this to the bank, but has tried to limit his priests online. And if that's the case, then I think there's probably a Catholic sensibility there that this kind of online speed, social media, costs the life of the soul, that we need stillness. We need reflection. If we're moving that fast, it's very hard to trust. Now, there are exceptions. Recently, for example, I've been moved to discover some of the videos from Robert Nugent here in Ireland, Decrevy, determined to be Catholic. Robert is certainly producing those videos very quickly, in contrast to everything I'm saying. But what I note with Robert is that he is sharing his heart, he's sharing his love for the church in a very moving way. And he's not always saying that he knows things. He's often saying that he's raising questions rather than giving answers. So I think that there, may well be a role for videos like that on a daily basis, where the person is so obviously aflame with love of the church and is humble enough to not claim that he knows everything. But, I don't watch much YouTube, but from what I've seen, I do rather suspect that Robert Nugent is rather rare. I really don't know if that many people could do what Robert's doing, turning videos out that quickly. And from the little I see on YouTube, where people are so motivated to jump to the algorithm, I fear that it is leading to the creation of, at its worst anyway, a rather toxic traditional YouTube culture, at least at its worst. At any rate, ladies and gentlemen, trying to do videos like that at that rate, it's just not me. If I were to sort of jump to the beat of the algorithm, try to get a video out every day or even every week, my videos would suffer enormously. I don't think they would have the same, I hope, quality of original searching, which I think they sometimes have at their best. So these are reasons why up to now I've really wanted to limit my online presence. But all of this is leading me into saying something else, ladies and gentlemen. In addition to trying to enrich the channel through the new community posts section, I'm also seriously playing with the idea of joining a program like Patreon. And frankly, to be uncomfortably frank, but to be honest with you, the reasons would have a lot to do with making ends meet. Now, I have resisted this over the years, partly because I've seen people, plug their thing on Patreon, and they're sort of saying things like, well, look at me, guys, I post, 50 times a week, or I don't know, support me, because I post so much. And I've been very aware that I could not post that frequently, and the quality of everything I would do would dreadfully suffer. So, in comparison to sort of modern norms and, this normalized world, it looks like what I have to offer in terms of the reign of quantity. That's a Tomberg expression, by the way. He very much critiques, the emphasis in our society on quantity. Quantity for him is something very shallow, and it is for me. But we live in a time of the reign of quantity, where what matters is if you can get dozens and dozens, hundreds and hundreds of YouTube videos up. And I felt very uncomfortable going on to Patreon when my output compared to other people is so meager. Nonetheless, I am working hard on these videos. A simple video that I'm doing now, which somebody else might have knocked off in, I don't know, a couple of hours, has taken me a couple of days or even 3 days when you count in the thumbnail and all the editing and all this stuff. And that is the way I intend to keep going. I would rather produce quality that I believed in than jump to the beat of the algorithm and try to actively get views. And so I've resisted Patreon for this very reason, but I may be beginning to break down and say, if there are some of you out there where I don't need to promise that I'm going to be doing a zillion videos, but could still help me in some way with the work I'm trying to do, then it would be gratefully received. Now, I will just say a little bit more about these tentative Patreon plans. On Patreon, I will be doing, if I do it, exclusive content. And maybe I can get Kim to do some exclusive content as well. It will be audio content. It's much easier for me to do audio content, and Kim actually has a problem with her vision, which means that staring into computer screens, cameras doesn't work for her. But if I can get some audio content from Kim, I think that would also enrich the channel. In fact, I will just say now, for those of you who, there's a few of you out there, there's a small community of people in my mind. Kim is such an incredible inspiration for everything I'm doing here, and we're both hoping to find ways to bring Kim more to the foreground, out of the background. For example, without Kim's deep sensitivity, especially to things like the liturgy, I wouldn't have made so much of the progress that I've made, just to say nothing of all Kim's prayers for me. It's to say nothing of what I see as her extraordinary love of Christ, Our Lady, the Church. She is just a tremendous inspiration for me, but there's more to say about that another time. Right now, I just thought I would, at the very end of this episode, for those of you who do listen to the episodes from beginning to end, say that we are, I think, moving towards something I've long resisted, some kind of greater online presence. And if there is any way any of you would feel moved to help, even if it's just $1 a month, something like that. I know that, because I'm speaking about, making ends meet, I know that a lot of us are having trouble making ends meet. Maybe particularly in Europe as opposed to other parts of the world, I'm not sure. So I may just put that out there. A final thing under the uncomfortable heading of making ends meet is that I will do the final thing that I normally do at the end of these videos, but with a twist. So normally at the end of these episodes, I do give my Amazon author page, where you can buy my 3 books. So there's a link down below and the text down below. But here's the twist. I not only want to say that if you haven't read my books yet, my books are what I'm actually proudest of. I believe in them far more than the videos, and that's partly because far more conscious reflection and thought went into them. The twist here is this: but any of my books that are bought through those links give an additional profit to myself. So if you just go to Amazon and you buy the book itself versus buying the book through the link, does help us. But here's the strange thing. Let's say you were to go to the link and you didn't want to buy any of my books. Maybe you have them already, or you're not interested, or whatever. But let's say you wanted to buy yourself a new computer or something like that. Strangely enough, by clicking on that link first, Amazon will give me a commission for the computer you buy. I just throw that out there. I feel strange about saying it all, but I think I'm going to conclude on this note, friends. It does seem to me that there are a growing number of people out there who are being very warm and very kind and responsive to the videos. I thank you all. I have been notoriously slow. I still find it very hard to keep up with people. Very hard. There are people that I do end up letting down. I'm not cut out for this 21st century world. But nonetheless, changes are afoot. Kim and I are being with some kind of greater community online presence. We need to ponder it, pray about it, meditate about it more, and Patreon does seem the way forward, with the exclusive content and maybe some of the other community features there that we are still exploring. One last tiny little thing that hardly seems important to say, but I want to say it. A while back, YouTube started imposing adverts on small channels. All those adverts that you are seeing on my channel have nothing to do with me. We get nothing from them. It's simply something that Google imposed on small channels, and frankly, it really, really bothers me a lot. But there, I've been wanting to say that for a while. I won't hold you up any longer. If, for those of you who are still listening with this minutia, I will just say, if you got this far, friends, thank you as ever. Thank you for listening, and may God richly bless you in these troubled times.